Good morning, good afternoon, good day to you, wherever you are in the world. We're delighted that you're joining us for this webinar today about navigating the transitioning away from fossil fuel and deforestation roadmaps. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes for everybody to join, and then we'll get started. If you've joined the call already, please do introduce yourself in the chat and where the organization that you're coming from and where you're calling in from. We will have the chat you should be able to save and also to send messages to other attendees and also to ask any questions of our panelists as we go through today's presentation. We are recording the session today to share with anybody that isn't able to attend, and also so that we can share on our YouTube channel with all of the different interpreted languages. So if you want to access interpretation, today's webinar I will be presenting in English, as will Ignacio, but Oscar and Wara will be presenting in Spanish. So we have translation into Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Bahasa Indonesia. And you can find that under the 3 dots under the More and then the interpretation icon, and you can choose your channel. So just to say again, welcome, good morning, good day, good evening to you all, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this GroundWork webinar, Navigating the TAFF and Deforestation Roadmaps. And I'm Philippa Bailey. I'll be your host today from the GroundWork project. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know which organization you're coming from and where you're calling in from in the world. It's always really inspiring to see who is joining our webinars. And you'll also be able to communicate with other attendees in the chat. Today's call is being recorded to share again with people who can't be here. And we also have live interpretation from the amazing team at Tinta. So if you need English, you would actually want to choose English under the interpretation icon. Likewise, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Bahasa Indonesia. And some of us will speak in English and some in Spanish. So it's great if you can choose the language that works for you. Just seeing that we've got maybe a challenge with the chat that somehow is not enabled for all the participants right now. That's pretty crucial, so we'll try to get that sorted.
Hi, everyone. Maybe what we can do, Philippa, to solve this chat problem for this webinar is share information in the Q&A section, because it seems that we all have access to that.
Okay, yeah.
So
very happy to do that. So the first thing to share with you there is that well, I'm going to share.
maybe if you can use the Q&A to introduce yourself, all the audience that is present today, that would be
a little bit tricky. because it creates a kind of queue. But I've just put in the Q&A as an answer to Ignacio's question, the link to all of the slides for today translated into different languages. So if you want to look at those on your own machine or download those now, you're very welcome to do so. Otherwise, I think we're going to begin even without the chat, I'm afraid, just out of respect for your time and for that of our panelists. So to introduce the project, as I said, I'm Philippa Bailey. I work with an organization called the International Climate Politics Hub, and I'm also a consultant with the GroundWork project. And my co-conspirators in the GroundWork project are Paula Alvarado, who you just saw on the screen there, and Claire Biaison, and the whole Tinta team with whom we work in partnership. And this project is supported by CLUA, and we're very grateful to them for their support. So just to refresh your mind, what is GroundWork? It's a collaboration between the International Climate Politics Hub, Seeds for Change, which is Paula's organization, and Tinta. And we provide written and virtual policy briefings for Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant peoples organizations. Our briefings are co-developed with Indigenous leaders, so we're making sure that the topics that we're covering are those that are of greatest priority to Indigenous leaders. We're using policy intelligence from the International Climate Politics Hub, which is an international community of more than 600 people working in climate policy. And we also connect closely with the Indigenous Peoples Working Group within ICPH in order, again, to make sure that the topics that we're focusing on and the ways that we're talking about them match their priorities. We provide support at key climate policy moments throughout the year, and that's what we use as the focus for our webinars. So this one is focusing on the roadmaps process and on particularly the outcomes from the conference in Santa Marta in Colombia at the end of April. In terms of what we'll cover today, I'm going to do a little introduction and a setting of the scene. Then we'll go into talking about the transitioning away from fossil fuels roadmap. I will give the floor to Oscar Daza Gutierrez from OPIAC and to Wara Iris Ruiz Condori from Bolivia. And then we will move on to talking about the deforestation roadmap. I will give some background about that. And Ignacio Aranis from Earth Insight will talk about how some of the connection points between these two roadmaps. And we'll finish with your questions, but I'm hoping also that you can put your questions in the Q&A tool, and if we can get it sorted out into the chat. So just setting the scene a little bit, take you back to the end of last year and the conclusion of COP30 in Brazil. You see André Correa de Lago, the president of COP30, Anna Tony, the CEO, and Simon Steele from the UNFCCC there on the dais at the end. And just to remember, it was the largest presence ever of Indigenous peoples at a COP. So even though the outcomes from that COP were quite disappointing in many ways for Indigenous peoples, there was a huge presence and a huge mobilization of Indigenous peoples' voices there. At the conclusion of COP30, some of the greatest disappointments came in terms of the negotiated outcomes. Claire, if you can just move to the next slide. There was, despite the COP being called the COP of the forest, there was really no substantial negotiated outcome on deforestation and no substantial negotiated outcome on transitioning away from fossil fuels, which had been named for the first time 2 years before at COP28 as being an explicit goal of the UNFCCC process. But nonetheless, many countries who were there in Brazil felt strongly that there should be outcomes on these two important topics. And so the COP presidency proposed that they would initiate roadmaps on those two topics in a process that would be in parallel with the UNFCCC process, but that would engage the countries that wanted to move forward. And in that way, they were able to avoid some of the countries that regularly block any efforts to even discuss or take substantive decisions on these items. Since that moment in Brazil, as we all know, the world has changed. And geopolitically, things have become even more unstable. War in Iran and the Middle East has been particularly impactful for fossil fuels, with the prices of oil and gas rising, causing rising prices on all goods, potentially fertilizer shortages, and many other consequences. And I think there's now a very strong realization for countries that relying on fossil fuels exposes them to the potential for repeated and uncontrollable crises. And that the countries that move first to deal with this will not only reduce their exposure to future shocks, but can also give a shape to the transition away from fossil fuels. So this, even though we in the climate community and certainly Indigenous peoples have been advocating for a long time that we need to move away from fossil fuels, the changing geopolitical situation makes new things possible in terms of countries' agendas. So what is a roadmap? Because when these kinds of things are suggested, the fear is that it's going to be just another report. The model that we're working with is that a roadmap is both a compass, it gives a sense of direction of where we need to go, but it also has to be an accelerator. It has to move us more quickly towards the goals that we set. So this idea of combining a compass and an accelerator is combining direction and delivery. It also has to balance clarity and flexibility for different countries. So it has to be meaningful for countries as they try to enact it in their own situation, in their own contexts and situations. And as we've said, it's a model that can be devised by those that want to move forward, so it can escape to some extent the forces of countries that would block any action. And in the case of fossil fuels, that's mainly the fossil fuel producing countries. Also, by having a process that takes place outside the UNFCCC, there is the potential for a more open format. And you can just see here a picture from Santa Marta of the kinds of formats that we used for conversations. It's very different from a negotiating room where countries are discussing and arguing about the placement of commas in a sentence and the exact use of words. It also means that there's more potential for the engagement of civil society, which, as we know in the UNFCCC, that's often as observers of the process. But in this more open format, there's the potential for different stakeholders and rights holders to shape the process and really contribute. And we'll hear more from Oscar about that. So just to be clear, there are two separate roadmaps that are being developed this year. One on transitioning away from fossil fuels. And it was that roadmap for which the Santa Marta conference was like a first stepping stone and a first experiment as to what that conversation could be about. The second roadmap is about halting and reversing deforestation, and both of them are due to report at COP31 in Turkey at the end of this year. So the questions that we'll be looking at today are really, what are the roadmap processes? How are Indigenous peoples involved in those processes? What outcomes do we expect from those processes? And what further opportunities for engagement and shaping are there for Indigenous peoples and local communities and Afro-descendant peoples? So that's that's my little overview, I guess, of where we are with the roadmaps. But I'd like to dive in now more deeply into the transitioning away from fossil fuels roadmap before I invite Oscar to share his experiences and thoughts. So, in terms of what the roadmap needs to include, and this is according to the IISD, the Institute for Sustainable Development, it needs to address production and consumption, so the two sides of the equation. It needs to address access and affordability, because we know that for many across the world, access to energy at affordable prices is a very big challenge. It needs to address subsidies and how those subsidies underpin the fossil fuel industry. It needs to address, of course, the questions of a just transition. And I've highlighted this because this is the entry point that Indigenous peoples want to make very clear, that there is no transition unless it's a just transition. But I'm also highlighting that that is only one aspect of the fossil fuel transition as governments may see it. There's also the issues of decommissioning and cleanup. So how do we've made these environmental catastrophes around the world, how do we clean up that infrastructure and break it down? How do we start to change the way that finance supports the fossil fuel industry and its infrastructure? How do we govern these processes in a participatory way so that multiple people have a voice and power to make the transition happen? How do we set clear moments in time so that we know where we need to advance to, and that progress is transparent to everybody that wants to know about it? And how do we mobilize a whole of government, and I'm sure the president of COP30 would say the whole of society kind of movement, so that it's not just owned by one ministry delivering a part of their agenda, but it's connected to all of the other branches of government and society. So there's a lot that a roadmap has to do. It's we can appreciate the complexity of that. In terms of this specific roadmap and this specific process, as I say, it was announced at COP30. There was a consultation period that went until early April, where stakeholders and rights holders were invited to contribute to shape the roadmap. Then at the Santa Marta conference, which was jointly held by Colombia and the Netherlands, representatives from 57 countries and 2,000 further participants from different civil society and industry bodies came together to discuss how this can actually happen. And we will hear from Oscar about the Indigenous Peoples Gathering, an autonomous Indigenous Peoples Gathering that happened before the conference in order to formulate a strong position and an expression of that position to the conference. But there was overall very broad civil society engagement in the way that I shared, that the process was more open than a COP process would be. From this point, there will be ongoing engagement at the UNFCCC meetings in Bonn next month, and then at climate weeks in London, New York, and other places around the world, and delivery of the roadmap at COP31 in Turkey. So in terms of the Santa Marta conference, this was the first of its kind, the first international conference on transitioning from fossil fuels. Um, and as I showed before, a more informal setting with government ministers and others being able to talk in an open format. And we will share the website for that conference. Oscar will talk, I hope, more about the Autonomous Indigenous Peoples gathering convened by OPIAC and the Mesa Permanente de Concertación, who also convened meetings in the run-up to the Santa Marta conference. And we will share also the position that the gathering produced, and Paula maybe can share that in the Q&A. So all of the consultations in advance of the meeting itself and at the Santa Marta meeting focused on three different pillars: the overcoming economic dependence on fossil fuels, so looking at how the financial flows that fossil fuels generate, but also the huge subsidies that are needed to create that infrastructure. How do we get beyond that? The second pillar was about transforming supply and demand, so thinking about how we phase down and close the infrastructure that produces fossil fuels, but also how do we switch to different sources of energy and the security and the sovereignty of those sources of energy. And finally, the third theme was about advancing international cooperation. So thinking about how will this process feed back into the UNFCCC, and also thinking about some of the legal barriers that exist that make it difficult, that are causing us to be locked in to a fossil fuel economy. So I would love to give the floor now to Oscar Daza Gutierrez, who is a member of the Coreguaje people in Colombia, and also the Secretary General of OPIAC from 2023 to 2027. So Oscar, I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Sí, no, muchas gracias. Saludar a todos. Gracias
Thank you very much. Greetings to
por darle este
everyone.
espacio también a la OPIAC,
Thank you very much for
Organización de los
giving
Pueblos
OPIAC
Indígenas
this space
Colombianos
as well.
como pueblos indígenas
The
aquí
Colombian
en la
Indigenous
región
People
andina.
Organization.
Los saludamos a todos.
And we're the
Es un
representatives
gusto estar
from the
presente
Colombian Amazon
en
region.
este
It's a pleasure to
importante
be able to greet you
evento
all, be able
bueno,
to
ya
greet you all from here. My name is
dentro
Oscar
de la
Dacia. I am a
contextualización que hemos
Coreguaje
tenido,
Indigenous People. And within the
resalto dos cosas,
contextualization that
¿sí?
we've had,
Y es importante
I want
también
to highlight a
sobre todo
few
por el
things.
trabajo que han venido
And
realizando
we need to
pueblos
deepen
indígenas
into the
en
word
Colombia,
work
pero
that the
también
indigenous
a nivel
peoples have been carrying out, both in
mucho más
Colombia as well as
general,
in
quienes
other
también
countries in a
estuvimos
more
allí,
general setting,
indígenas de varias
because they were
regiones
also present
y que es
here
necesario
as
resaltar.
representatives
De
from
parte
different
nuestra, por
social
OPIAC, pues
cultural
hicimos un
regions. So we have to
ejercicio
highlight
de cómo
that in our
nosotros
community, we carried
unir,
out an
¿sí?
exercise
Digamos,
of how
la
we were
posición, las
uniting
propuestas como tal
the
de los pueblos
voices, the
indígenas
position,
y
and
realmente
our positions that are
el
indigenous
pasado,
peoples.
pues, y lo que hemos venido trabajando, ¿sí? Desde la COP30
And
ahorita,
this is what we've been
la
working
conferencia, pues,
during
la edición más exitosa
COP30,
de transición que se
during
realizó en Santa Marta,
the
eso nos ha
energy
llevado
transition
a ir
conference in Santa
consolidando
Marta.
mucho más, ¿sí? Nuestras
And
apuestas
that has
y
helped us
cómo
to
también visibilizar,
consolidate our
¿sí? Cómo
position
digamos que de alguna manera
and has helped us specialize
¿sí?
ourselves and
Visibilizar nuestras apuestas.
raise awareness of our
Básicamente
positions.
expresaría eso. Eh,
That's the first thing I'd like to share.
bueno, frente a una serie de reflexiones que se ha mencionado, ¿sí? No sé si digamos que de alguna
And
manera ya entramos
regarding to the rest of
en
the
detalles
reflections
ya
that we've had, I'm not
también
sure
de
if we
nuestra
can
parte
go
y
deep into
expresar
any of
lo que
them
pues
from
también
our side
hemos
and
realizado y la
start
experiencia pues que nos
sharing
ha traído
the work that
esta
we've carried
experiencia.
out previously and the experience that has brought us to participate in these spaces.
Yes, please do highlight that, and it would be so helpful to hear from you. You know, the part how the articulation of Indigenous peoples landed into the high level segment, and the parts of that process that you feel strong about, and places where you have deep concerns about how Indigenous peoples' voices will shape this roadmap?
De acuerdo. Sí, muchas gracias. Bueno,
Thank you
respecto
very
a,
much. Yes, of
partimos
course. So,
de una
highlight.
experiencia pues muy reciente, ¿no? De lo que pasó en Santa
We are
Marta. Nos
having
parece
our very
pues
recent
un
experience in
paso muy
Santa
importante
Marta,
que también le
and we
estamos
do
dando
believe it's an
como
important
países y
step
hacer también a
that
Colombia
some of the countries
y
are
Países Bajos
also
que pues también
having. We also want to thank
impulsaron
Colombia and the
esta actividad
Netherlands,
que
who were
tenemos.
the ones who supported
Nosotros como pueblos indígenas y
this
también
conference
bajo
and being carried out.
perspectivas también aquí de los pueblos
As
indígenas y
indigenous
particularmente de la OPIAC,
peoples
pues
in
consideramos
Colombia
que
and also with
resaltamos
OPIAC, we
la
believe
naturaleza
that
misma en que se dio esta
we are
actividad.
highlight
Creemos que
the nature in which we're
se
living.
dio a entender y lo vimos también de esa manera, de que fue mucho más amplio, ¿sí? Participativo, donde pues fue mucho más abierto.
We want to
Y
have
eso
this more
conllevó pues a todo tipo de
participative spaces, more open
diferencias
more open
con
spaces,
las
and this
COP,
created
con las COPs
differences
en la que hemos venido
regarding
participando.
the different COPs in
Entonces,
which we had
hay que resaltar
participated
esa
beforehand.
diferencia, cómo también
So we
estos
have to highlight the
espacios
difference.
conllevan a que
How these spaces
eh, se recoja mucho más la voz de, en este caso, los
make
pueblos
it
indígenas.
so
Y
that
eso vimos, ¿sí?
indigenous
Tanto
people's
en lo que
voices in
pasó en
this
Santa
case
Marta, pero
are
donde
more
hacemos
listened to.
diferencia con otros
And that's what
espacios
we saw
en
in
otros
Santa
foros,
Marta
¿sí? En la cual hemos estado
as compared
participando.
to other spaces such
Y
as,
hablar
for
de manera
example,
mucho más
all the
clara y de
COPs.
manera mucho más puntual.
And it's about
Entonces,
talking
hablar
in a more
cómo
clear
identificar de
fashion,
manera
more
rápida
timely
cómo era
fashion.
un alto riesgo, ¿sí?
This
Nuestros
is
procesos
a high
indígenas,
risk,
cómo de alguna manera también
how
resaltamos
extractivism
que de la transición
poses
justa,
high
como usted lo ha
risk.
mencionado,
And when we're talking
hay
about
otras
a fair
implicaciones que hay
transition,
que
as you were
revisar, ¿sí?
saying,
La cual
there are
nosotros,
other
de manera
implications we
muy
must look
puntual, en este
into.
caso como pueblos indígenas también expresamos,
And
¿sí?
as indigenous
Esa
people, we are
transición
expressing
justa
this in a
también
very
tiene
timely
que
manner.
involucrar, ¿sí?
This
También la no
fair
extracción,
transition
¿sí?
must also
Minerales
include
críticos, en la cual pues
a
se considera
non-extractivism, for example, of critical
como han
minerals,
dicho varios estudios, ¿sí? Que pues, a la
as
larga
many
pues
other
toda
studies have
esta
already
área que estamos en
reflected.
orden de depender de combustibles fósiles, pues va a implicar
If
una
we're
alta
not
demanda
dependent
de minerales
on
críticos y eso
fossil
pues también
fuels
tenemos
anymore,
que
that's going to
valorar
increase
y
demand
queremos
heavily
que
for these critical
también eso
minerals.
sea afectado
And we
y
do
que pues
not
nuestros territorios sigan siendo afectados.
want for that to happen.
Entonces
We do not
vemos
want for our
lo que
territories
sucede en
to
Santa
keep
Marta,
being burdened by
vemos
this
lo que tiene que
extractivism.
ver
If
con
we
las
think
dinámicas
of
de las
Santa,
COP
what happened in
y
Santa
de igual
Marta,
manera como
and we
pueblos
look
indígenas
into the
lo vimos
COPs of into the dynamics of previous
llegamos
COPs,
¿sí?
as
con
indigenous
propuestas,
peoples,
como nosotros también
we came by with a specific
traíamos
proposal
allá en ese escenario pues un poco más político de los estados unas
on for this
soluciones
more
que nos
political
traemos
approach. We
que
were bringing
tengan un
with
impacto
real
directamente pues en
solutions
sus
that will
territorios
have
¿sí?
a real
Y esa
impact to the
implementación
territories. And from there,
de la
we can look
transición
into the
sí,
implementation of a
justa y
just
que pues se acorde
transition
también a las realidades directamente
that
de
will
los
be, of
territorios, ¿sí?
course,
Entonces, eso es
adapted
un
to the
poco
reality of the
poder
different
entender
territories.
qué pasó ahorita recientemente y
So
cómo también
that's
pues de alguna manera
how
también
we can understand what happened
lo vemos
just
como
a
una
few
oportunidad
days
frente
ago.
después de lo que
And we, of
pasó en las
course,
otras COPs
perceive
en
this
que
as
hemos
an
participado,
opportunity as opposed
de
to
poder
the other COPs in which we have
ir avanzando y
participated.
resaltar, ¿sí? Y hay que resaltar
This
también
allows
eso
us
que mencionamos,
to
pues que suena un
keep
poco
working
fácil,
on
también
it.
lo vemos como una oportunidad.
And in a very
Nuestra
much more open space,
OPIAC
we can also highlight our
Colombia
voices a little bit more. And in the
avanzamos
case of
¿sí?
Colombia, in the case of
en poder
UPIAC, we kept working
construir, ¿sí? Liderar, más cuando
on
pues se lleva a
building
cabo un
and
escenario
leading,
así, pues
especially
en
when it
este
comes
caso en
to
Colombia, un escenario pues
conferences such as this one in
nos lleva
Colombia. In this
también a
case,
tener
such
un
an
papel
important
de
summit allow
anfitrión,
us to
pero
have
también de
the role
comunicador, ¿sí?
of
Para
hosts,
también escuchar y
and it
resaltar
allows
las
us to
propuestas de todos los
understand
pueblos
how we are
indígenas
leading
y
so that
también
we are
pues
able to
aportarle a
convey
cómo
all the positions
recoger esas
of
propuestas
indigenous peoples
desde los
worldwide.
diferentes
So at least we're trying
departamentos
to
y ahí fue cuando pues
understand
también
these
en
voices
las
from the
COPs
different regions in
y
the
las
world.
rutas
And in that
pues
sense, the
pudiéramos
OPIAC
nosotros recoger las propuestas
facilitated
y
a mechanism through which
compartir
we could gather all these different
los
positions.
pueblos
And
indígenas
so,
en
as
Colombia.
OPIAC, as
Generamos
Indigenous
unos
Peoples of
espacios
Colombia
diálogos
organization, we are
virtuales,
generating
por los también
virtual dialogue
retos que
spaces.
tenemos de
Of
poder
course, this
hacerlo
is one of the
presencial,
challenges
nos
that we
llevó
have
a
when it
darnos
comes to
reuniones
doing it in
virtuales,
person.
otras
We had
presenciales,
virtual
y eso nos permitió
meetings. We
también de
had
alguna
different
manera
virtual meetings. So that
anticiparnos
allowed us
a
to anticipate
a la recolección de las propuestas
this gathering of the different feedbacks, different positions, create a single document. So I want to highlight this this work that we carried out beforehand. This is something we did independently. We want to consolidate our positions as well. And then in person, when we started this formal meeting, in the case of this first conference for TAFF, we also had the option of having autonomous spaces, to have our own spaces as indigenous peoples of Colombia and of the rest of the world, in which we debated important points in order to, as I was saying, to have agreed upon positions so that we could also have concrete positions regarding the lines that the summit was, that the conference was bringing together. So that's what we were looking to contribute towards. So with that, we could conclude that we were able to build a document in a participative manner. And as I was saying, we gathered indigenous voices around the world, and how we approached within this document in keeping this perspective, this point of view of indigenous peoples when we're talking about a just transition. And the document does make it crystal clear, for example, including safeguards, very timely safeguards that must also be taken into account under the rights that we already have and that we have earned in other cases. So with that, we understand that these are actionable proposals, and those are principles that are very clear, and that despite the nature of the space, will help us to have uh, an impact and will help us raise awareness in different different countries. And as indigenous peoples, we are very interested in the energy transition, but we want a fair and just energy transition. And that brings us to impact. It's one thing to gather together, to dialogue, to carry out participatory work, but it's a whole different thing to see how we carry with that proposal to the conferences with this is debated, right? In the case of Santa Marta, how will we as indigenous peoples be able to bring our proposal to the high-level meetings? And as I was saying, that's something we must take into account, since it was a very open space that allowed us to have a participation that is time limited, in which we couldn't share the proposal in its completeness. However, we were able to give some specific proposals with the voices of indigenous peoples in Colombia and worldwide. And that allowed us also to create alliances, and the participatory dynamics in national and international spaces such as the COP has given us the experience of needing to have dialogues with different governments and different organizations, so that through them we're able to bring our proposals. And we were able to, of course, we have to highlight that we had different different contacts with countries such as the UK, Tuvalu, and other Pacific island nations who are interested in indigenous voices, and they are giving us the opportunity to take a stand. So within these proposals, I would like to highlight some of them. What did we include in this document as indigenous peoples? And since we've already carried out similar work in different spaces, other COPs, we really push so that indigenous peoples' rights are taken into account, whether they be more regionals, such as free informed determination at a national level, as well as international rights. We must take into account these guarantees that are inherent for indigenous peoples that are recognized internationally. And how do we also guarantee protection of the territories for indigenous peoples, the land indigenous people, the waters also for indigenous peoples, as we have shared also with other indigenous peoples around the world. So we must not also limit ourselves to a specific approach, but rather that we have to keep working by guaranteeing the rights to the different populations, and especially we underline the rights of indigenous peoples. So we must stop. We need to eliminate or not reproduce, or at the very least, stop this kind of colonialism and extractivism in our territories. And this is something that we're demanding under certain indigenous peoples. If nothing else, then that. We're talking about transition, we're talking about switching energy sources. But on the other hand, we have the other problem. We're exploiting and we're looking for critical minerals that are present in indigenous peoples' territory. So warranties must be broader about eliminating this way of colonialism. This is one of the positions that we shared within this document and that we were able to bring to the high-level meetings in this conference. And one of the topics that we highlighted is raising awareness, as we have done in different spaces such as other COPs, the uncontacted indigenous peoples. That's one of the demands that we have. That's one of the strong positions that we have as indigenous peoples. We must guarantee their natural states to those indigenous peoples, and any intervention in these territories must guarantee their own right to self-determination and previous undetermined consent. And the principle of non-contact. Because we're talking about highly vulnerable indigenous peoples, and that's one of the things we proposed and that we reflected in the document for the conference. And within this framework of demands, we must also take into account indigenous defenders and defenders of land, because we have many indigenous leaders who have been victims, who have been victimized due to the fact that they're defending their territory. They are criminalized, they are not defended, they're not protected, they have their rights trampled upon, their lives are sometimes trampled upon, and we do need to be protected, and we must be acknowledged that indigenous defenders and indigenous land defenders do not have it easy, especially when it comes to fossil fuels, because when in the framework in which we have most victimized is when we are facing off to extractivist projects, and this is one of the biggest issues. And so within this process, we think it is important to highlight the work that they are already carrying out, what we have done for COP30, the work that has started, as well as the work that we have carried in this conference. I think that's important, and I think that's important to highlight.
if we see this in terms of nature or the objectives that we seek to achieve in all of our spaces, well, they are different. We don't have the same objectives. However, we have some common purposes. And in that regard, we say that whatever contribution we can make within the framework of this transition to move away from fossil fuels and the roadmaps, everything combined guide us on one direction. And that's how we need to work on just one direction. So with OPIAC, we made progress. We have been doing advocacy activities. OPIAC also has its own position in terms of a few of the things I mentioned before, and that is what leads us to say that our processes are very solid. As indigenous peoples around the world, we have our own process and we are becoming stronger and stronger. We were able to position ourselves in terms of the PSC with the Just Transition Program, and that's something that has to be highlighted. We continue to advocate for this, and as mentioned in paragraph 12, we need to highlight that within the framework of the last COP, we achieved a lot of things, and we are confident in our ability to continue to make progress as indigenous peoples. As you are all well aware of, these roadmaps created by COP also forces us to reflect upon the possibility of gathering all contributions, of using all contributions and coming up with a legally binding instrument, as we call them here in Colombia. That is what indigenous peoples here in Colombia have been advocating for. So we have made progress. We continue to contribute to the roadmaps in terms of deforestation and also TAFF. We have been making contributions. But what do we want to achieve next? I know that I have very little time left. So, within this framework of the roadmaps, what we also seek to achieve is to make sure that these roadmaps translate into tangible results and that our contributions are heard by governments, by the states. We hope that the next administration, the next presidency, will take into account our contributions as indigenous peoples. We want our contributions to truly be reflected in the results. We want all of this to show how we indigenous peoples have been working together, contributing to this. So one of the messages we would like to convey from OPIAC, and well, in the case of Colombia, as indigenous peoples of the Colombian Amazon rainforest, this is the message we want to convey to the world. We want to achieve tangible results, and we also always talk about indigenous territories free from extractivism. We want our indigenous territories to be free of extractivism. That is the last message I wanted to share with you all. And this is the end of my intervention. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Oscar. And for really expressing to us the key elements of what this amazing bringing together of indigenous peoples before Santa Marta and at the conference itself, what you achieved there and the clear articulation that you want to bring into the international processes, as you say. Thank you so much. I hope we will also call on your input a little bit later in the webinar for other comments. So just to go back to pick up the thread and continue this story, as Oscar said, and as I tried to frame before, the Santa Marta process is not about negotiations. So there's no final agreed text as we would see from a COP, but a report will come from the co-chairs from Colombia and the Netherlands. And as Oscar says, we want to see that reflect the positions of indigenous peoples as they were clearly articulated, and to make sure that the process can really absorb and understand what Indigenous peoples are demanding. There will be another conference along the lines of the Santa Marta conference next year to be held in Tuvalu. So between Tuvalu and Ireland will be the next co-hosts. And it's really important to see how can this process, which as we've said is quite different from the COP process, how can it nonetheless feed in a positive way, and maybe change that process for the better, because many of us working in it, feel that there is a terrible deadlock that is preventing progress from really being made. I would encourage you, my colleague Paula in the chat has been sharing Indigenous Peoples' position paper, which has been translated into many languages. Also, I would encourage you to look at Larissa Baldwin-Roberts, who was one of the Indigenous representatives who spoke to the high-level segment in the Santa Marta conference. So it's very much worth seeing what she said. But on the question that Oscar was raising about the impact of Indigenous peoples' interventions, I think it's encouraging to say that the minister from Tuvalu said very clearly that as a region that knows what it means to be excluded, we will ensure inclusivity in every facet of our preparations and in the conference itself. Indigenous peoples are rights holders, and we will ensure their full, effective and self-determined participation. And that's in reference to next year's conference. Coming out of Santa Marta were three kind of important work streams that were identified by the conference. The first one around national roadmaps for transition. So how do we take the big concepts of transitioning away from fossil fuels and make it relevant to national contexts and enable countries to come up with their own roadmaps? And what role might the scientific panel, which they started in Santa Marta, what role might that have in informing how that transition happens? There's another work stream looking at economic dependencies and the architecture that can support the transition away. And then the third work stream is looking at fossil fuel-free trade systems and how to connect producers and consumers in ways that don't rely on fossil fuel infrastructure. So as we talk about the translation of this conference into national roadmaps, I want to invite Wara, who is an Aymara indigenous woman from Bolivia, and she's going to contextualize a little bit what is happening in Bolivia right now on this issue of fossil fuel exploitation and the potential for transition. So Wara, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Filipa, for this invitation. I am very glad to be here, and also I will be sharing my presentation in Spanish. Buenos días a todos y también buenas noches a cada una de
Good
las
morning,
regiones.
good evening, in
Gracias por
wherever
esta
you are
invitación en
in the world. Thank you
espacio.
very much
Voy a
for
compartir
attending
acerca
the
de mi
webinar, for being in this
territorio.
space. I will share a
Soy
few
aymara
details about my territory.
indígena
I am an Aymara
de los
indigenous
Andes y
woman
también
from
soy
the Andes,
activista
and
ambiental
I am also an
en mi país.
environmental
Trabajo en
activist
temas de
in my
coordinación de
country.
proyectos
I work
a
on
nivel
topics dealing
regional.
with project
El día de
management
hoy voy a
at the
permitirme
regional
compartir
level.
un
And
caso muy
today, if you
interesante
allow me to do so, I will
sobre
share with you a very
la
interesting case
persecución de
about
defensores ambientales
the
indígenas y no indígenas,
persecution
pero
of
también
environmental
la
defenders, both indigenous
amenaza
and
a
non indigenous, and also the threat posed
a
against
un área de
a center,
conservación en
a
nuestro país
conservation
llamado
area
Tariquía.
in our
Y
country known as
esta
Tariquia.
situación se ha agravado
And this
en esta
situation has
ocasión.
been
Te voy a
worsening
compartir el
in recent
contexto
times.
socioambiental y estrategias de
So I
defensa
will
del
be
territorio.
sharing more details
¿Cómo
about the social,
está tomando el
environmental
tema de
details,
hoy
and
mi
my
tema?
activism,
Porque
the
esta
defense of the
pequeña región
territory, and how all
llamada
these
Tariquía,
aspects
que se
are linked
encuentra
to
en
one
el
another.
sur de
Because in this
Bolivia, en
region,
Tarija,
Tariquia, which is in
eh,
southern Bolivia, in the Tarija
existe
region,
una
we
reserva de
find
gas y petróleo
a gas
importante
reserve and gas and oil reserve, which is of paramount importance to the country. And this protected area was created in 1989, many years ago. It is also protected based on the law and the political constitution of Bolivia, and it hosts many species and a um, water reserve, which is fundamental for the region, for the Bolivian forests, and Tucumán in Argentina. And it is home to many indigenous and peasant communities. However, in January 2026, police officers entered, invaded the region to make sure that new machines are used to exploit both oil and gas. As a result of this, what we see right now is that despite the progress we made in terms of negotiations, negotiations around deforestation, or maybe the exploitation of oil and gas and other transition minerals, despite all of this, we are still confronted with a violence. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay, so some background prior to the conflict. The beginning of the conflict didn't take place this year. There's a long history behind it. In 2015, some hydrocarbon activities were allowed, permitted in protected areas. And since between 2018 and 2019, there were conflicts because of oil projects. We hadn't really achieved any progress in terms of, COP and other spaces and the and the elimination of exports of hydrocarbons. We hadn't achieved that yet, but two companies were still present, fostering the exploitation of gas. So this conflict started in it didn't start in 2026. It is a result of many other conflicts that took place before. And well, this year we were confronted with the invasion. Let's move on to the next slide. And now we can see a timeline about this reality. We can see that between January the 1st and the 4th, some community leaders had to prevent the entry of Petrobras. And well, many people who provided this project, the current government, say that this project is necessary because there is a hydrocarbon crisis, a fuel crisis in the country, and there is another project called also 3X, or bear in Spanish, OSO 3X, which needs to be implemented according to these people. There is another company that entered the region, and it says it has the necessary environmental permissions and authorizations. They say they are compliant with the law. And well, police officers also entered the area and they detained 17 environmental defenders who are now being processed in court. And a few days ago, 12 of them were finally released. That said, in January, everything started, and many of our brothers and sisters were very far away in other regions, providing us with support to make sure that this invasion didn't go any further. And well, political centers and all other social actors, even from the cities, provided us with support. This was a very complex scenario. Giving us help was not easy at all. And well, this was just the beginning of the year. We were not really expecting this to happen. And in the end, we were victims of violence by state forces. So, the company at issue said they were complying with all regulations, and well, our peoples were defending their territories, and some of our brothers and sisters were detained. And as I said before, they are now being processed in court. Later in January, by the end of the month, at the beginning of February, they were notified by the court, And well, these people who were detained in January, February, March, and April, they were processed in court. And last week, the hearing finally came to an end. And this is why 12 out of the 17 people who were detained were finally released and declared innocent. And well, they should have never been detained in the first place because these territories belong to them. This is still happening in our country. And unfortunately, this means that national plans on fossil fuels are not on the elimination of fossil fuels, the phasing out of fossil fuels are not making progress, are not really being implemented. So I believe we need to, this happens because the perspective of our government has changed when it comes to the defense of indigenous peoples, the defense of the territories, and also we are now confronted with a new social political reality. Many social organizations are now standing strong. They are demanding that their rights are respected much more than before, than in the past. And this will, of course, be reflected in their absence in national plans and national indexes and biodiversity plans devised by the government. Of course, these people, our people, the government is in favor of some fuel projects and not really focuses on the defense of the territories. And well, we continue to resist. We remain resilient. And this is an open call to all our brothers and sisters in our country so that we can raise awareness of the situation at the international level. We need to make sure that everyone knows what's happening. This is an emergency in Bolivia, a permanent emergency, and we continue to defend our territories and our biodiversity. So that's what I wanted to share with all of you today. We still need to make much more progress in terms of national plans and this and we also need to respect some international conventions signed by our countries. Our governments need to ratify those conventions, and we, as Bolivian activists, wish to dialogue, to discuss with the government and social collectives. That's something that we have been starting to do in this new period, and we hope that this will give us more strength to defend our territories. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, wow. Thank you so much, Wara, for your powerful words. And I think this is so important that we understand how the international negotiations and then the agreements and the conversations can actually manifest at a national level and need to really appreciate the context of the activism, the issues that people are fighting for, the dangers that defenders are putting themselves in to save and to conserve what they value and what we all value so much. We really have to find very sensitive tools that can work at the national level and enable people to move their struggle forward. So I think Ignacio, in a few minutes, will talk a little bit about some of the ways that, exactly as Wara has been talking about, the defense of the forest and the exploitation of fossil fuels, how those two concepts are linked. But just before we do that, I'm going to go back and just talk a little bit about the deforestation roadmap process so that we sort of bring both processes together at the end of the webinar. So much like the fossil fuel roadmap process, the deforestation roadmap came out of the COP28 agreement in the what's called the global stocktake, that countries agreed to put efforts towards halting and reversing deforestation by 2030. And nobody needs to say that that is a very, very short timeline to achieve huge changes in the patterns of deforestation that we see around the world, and particularly in the major forest basins. And this requires aligning policy tools, the public finance that is being used to, in some cases, to support deforestation, unfortunately, and the private finance and how that is also fueling deforestation. And again, we have this concept of the compass and the accelerator, that the roadmap can act as a way to point the direction we need to go and to really accelerate movement. And it's a little bit different, the deforestation roadmap, because there is already a lot of policy around deforestation, which doesn't really exist for transitioning away from fossil fuels. So in a way, it's much more about bringing together the commitments that countries have already made and have, the plans that they've said they want to enact, and finding a way to strengthen that and to bring in the perspectives of others, like Indigenous peoples. So the roadmap needs to see that forests are not just beautiful things to have. I don't need to say this to anybody on the call, but that they are economic infrastructure, that they are our life and our livelihoods, and that we need to value them in that way. And align financial flows so that they're not constantly undermining the forests, and the ability of the people who live and guard the forests as well to do that. We need to think about it as an integrated system, thinking about not just the economics, but also how is the land being used, what are the tools for governance, how is food being grown in areas that are at risk of deforestation, and the patterns of water use. So it needs to be a big picture that integrates all the elements of a healthy environment, and put people and their rights, including land tenure, secure land tenure, not just at the center of concern, but at the center of delivery, because these are people who are already living in the forests, who are already guardians of these environments. So it's about recognizing their agency and their power and putting them in the center of the solutions. A forest roadmap needs to think about the drivers of deforestation, and particularly food systems, how we make the food that we need on the planet and reduce waste. We need to shift the incentive structures so that forests are worth more when they're standing than when they're cleared. And tools like the Tropical Forest Forever facility are trying to do that kind of thing. And any roadmap needs to talk about cooperation, collaboration, and transparency, so that this is, again, a shared effort, and not just about saying to governments, oh, you work it out in your country, especially when there aren't good platforms for people to collaborate with civil society. In terms of this roadmap process, it's being run by Itamaraty ministry in Brazil. Again, there was a consultation process open until early April, and 17 different country submissions, and also submissions from other stakeholders, including Indigenous Peoples organizations. There will be further consultation using the action agenda, which is kind of the parallel process to the negotiations, that again is about mobilizing a whole of society approach and not just relying on countries to take action. There are key moments at the UN Forum on Forests, which is happening in New York right now. And again, the forest roadmap will be delivered at COP31. In terms of consultation of Indigenous peoples, there has been consultation, as I said, until April, but actually ongoing consultation is not just possible, but desired. And if you want to see the kind of submissions that Indigenous peoples organizations have made, I would refer you to the IFGIA consultation document with 8 partner organizations that submitted recommendations, and I'll share a little bit about what that looks like in a moment. as I say, the Brazilian presidency is open to still hearing from Indigenous peoples organizations. And actually, you can find the email address of the person in charge in Itamaraty, which is Marco Tulio Cabral. In the chat there, I see Paula just posted that. And they are open to hearing what our Indigenous peoples demands for this roadmap. What does this roadmap need to include in order to meet your expectations? So in terms of the recommendations that the IVGIA consultation focused on, it was to recognize Indigenous peoples' rights, prioritize land tenure, respect free, prior and informed consent, Indigenous governance systems, to engage with Indigenous knowledge systems, invest in forest monitoring, address the implementation gap, the gap between what we say we want to do and what actually happens, and to protect Indigenous environmental defenders. As I say, you can download that and have a look at that submission. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ignacio Aronis from Earth Insight, who works in nature and climate diplomacy. Earth Insight generate remarkable insights about our planet and use that in political advocacy. And Ignacio is going to talk a little bit about how the forest agenda and the fossil fuel agenda can come together through some really concrete examples. So Ignacio, you have the floor.
Thank you, Filipa, and thank you to all the GroundWork team and my very strong sort of thank you as well to the previous speakers. As it usually happens when one speaks at the end of a webinar, I can only start by saying that I strongly agree and support much of what has been said before. I think we are here in a context amongst friends and allies, and it is normal that we have thoughts and ideas that are very aligned. So what I may present may sound repetitive, but I used to have a boss that said that if you have something useful to say, you should just say it over and over and over. So bear with me. Indeed, as Filipa was saying, and as the previous speakers have been presenting, we have these two big political processes in front of us for countries, right? After COP30, there's the opportunity to forward these roadmaps, these compasses, these accelerators of action on both fossil fuels and forests. But having two missions in front of you can sometimes also lead to distraction or counterproductive relations between the two issues. So how do we avoid putting too much attention to one of the topics or working in silos in a way that work done on fossil fuels or work done on forest is not necessarily mutually supportive? And how do we create spaces where we can speak to each other and collaborate even if we're working across the two different topics? So what I will try to present is some ideas on how we can do that. They're very simple and they're very intuitive, and I think that's part of their value as well. And by no means they're new to Indigenous leaders and Indigenous peoples who have been putting forward proposals that are focused on territorial protection. But I think it's important to say that the roadmaps are a great opportunity to push these proposals forward once more. So next slide, please. Indeed, only, as I was saying, a holistic approach to the climate crisis will bring enduring solutions, solutions that are just and enduring. Solutions that take into account the whole complexity of the issue on the climate crisis. However, sometimes facing these very complex problems can lead to paralysis, and we need to offer countries a first step that offers, big results for little effort. And we believe at Earth Insight that the momentum behind ending fossil extraction, which has been it has been great. It's been really big, but it can also suppose a bit of a distraction and not allow us to put enough effort on forests. But we can flip that issue around and use the focus that is on the fossil transition to make sure that that fossil transition is also bringing benefits to the fight against deforestation. One way we can do that is through fossil-free zones, which are basically territorial policies that prioritize certain areas to end the extraction of fossil fuels, such as, for instance, in tropical forests. So as we are advancing this transition to stop the extraction of fossil fuels, why not start by protecting areas of particular ecological importance? The alternative to doing that is allowing international markets to basically take all of the decisions. So countries will tell you, well, let's just let the most competitive, the most economically advantageous projects to continue and end the ones that are least competitive. The problem is that as oil and gas prices fluctuate, like we're seeing now with the Iran war, and it will happen again in the future, in the next few decades, we will have other conflicts, we will have other international situations that make prices go up a lot and then go down very quickly again. That creates a very disorderly transition, right? Companies will invest in projects when the price is high, and then they will abandon those projects with horrible consequences for territories affected to very little benefit for the fossil transition. So making sure that we limit the possibility of fossil expansion and that we protect areas that have high ecological value is a way of bringing a bit of order into the fossil transition and at the same time accelerating it because we limit the possibilities for the expansion. And as you can see here on the slides, and this is just from the 3 tropical basins, it is very similar across the world. Fossil fuels are indeed also a threat to our forests. A lot of the fossil reserves that remain in the world are under old and very long growth and intact tropical forests. And this is a reality lived and understood by indigenous peoples very well, up to 21% of this tropical moist forest. So even if it's not the main driver of deforestation, and that is obviously, there's many other drivers of deforestation, such as agricultural expansion, stopping and starting by stopping the threat posed by fossil fuels can bring this mutual benefit to both roadmaps and can be a first step for both countries that want to end fossil extraction, but they're looking for a first step that might put them on this pathway. And likewise, countries that are looking to end different drivers of deforestation can stop an industry that is often the first one to cut into the forest and to build roads and infrastructures that then other industries like logging or agriculture use to expand into your territories and into the forests. So a very intuitive solution, one that obviously has been uplifted as well in the Santa Marta recommendations from indigenous peoples as exclusion zones, but not the only, not a silver bullet. Next slide. Thank you. This is just to use the Amazon as an example. Here, it's not, the focus is not necessarily in the whole forest, but those lands that are already recognized as indigenous territories and when there is land tenure for indigenous peoples. You can see that the threat from oil and gas, which is the spots that are red, is very high for your communities and your territories. Up to 12% of indigenous peoples' lands in the Amazon are threatened by oil and gas. But as we heard before from other speakers, oil and gas are not the only threats to forest. And a risk of putting too much focus on the fossil transition may lead to accelerating other threats to forests. So here you see in purple, these are mining concessions from energy transition minerals. And in brown, you can see logging concessions. So for forestry and for cutting down trees for bioenergy or for other uses. So how do we avoid this? If we put too much focus on fossil-free zones, if we put too much focus on stopping the extraction of fossil fuels, are we then giving a green light to accelerating the extraction of minerals, where we should be sure to build strong guardrails that avoid that? They're both a bit of different sectors because fossil fuels are in a general decline. So it's about managing that decline. And minerals are, it's a new market that is being created. So it's about directing that growth of that market towards areas that are not as valuable for our ecosystems, that are not tropical forests, that are not intact forests, where there's no indigenous peoples land tenure, unless they so wish to develop mining, etc. Next slide, please. Just to bring a bit of diversity and to showcase that it's not just a threat to the Amazon, but it's one that is common to indigenous peoples across the world. Here you can see particularly wood concessions in Indonesia spreading across the whole archipelago and threatening indigenous territories. And in the next slide, you can see the same for the Congo region, for the Congo Basin region. Now, there's different data, and it seems like the threat might be bigger in the Amazon, but that's very much related as well to data availability, because the recognition of indigenous lands, or at least lands that are inhabited by indigenous peoples, is much lower, in particular in the Congo Basin. But nonetheless, of the lands that are recognized, 38% are under oil and gas blocks, and 42% are under mining concessions. So making sure that the roadmaps to transition away from fossil fuels and to end deforestation address these industrial threats and create bridges between both, so that we can advance both roadmaps together in a way that we're not creating more problems for each other, is fundamental, as you can see. And we can do that, as I was saying in the beginning, by building some sort of guardrails. Guardrails is another word that sounds very abstract, but it really is about identifying areas where we don't want minerals to be expanded, so no-go areas, but also better rules for companies so that they have to identify their supply chains and not buy minerals from areas that are of critical importance. Also, better accounting methods for bioenergy. Bioenergy sometimes does not account the whole destruction that it brings to ecosystems. If we focus too much only on exclusively on CO2, we're not taking into account other environmental degradation, and even within CO2, we're not fully accounting for all of the emissions that they bring. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Felipe. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Ignacio. And I'm just encouraging people to put their questions for all of our panelists into the chat, please, so that we can reflect on those together. I also just wanted to invite Oscar maybe to talk a little bit about fossil fuel free zones in Colombia, because I know that Colombia is at the forefront of enacting some of the legislation that could support the ideas that Ignacio has just been talking about. So, Oscar, would you like to comment on that?
Sí, no, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias también. Lo que he expresado,
Thank you. Thank you very much to Ignacio for sharing what he has shared.
yo creo que muy ambiciosa y hacia ella se tiene que
It
dirigir
is, of course, an
los gobiernos,
ambition
¿no?
proposal,
Nosotros como pues parte de este
and
proceso
as part of the
tenemos que
process as
buscar que
OBIAC,
claramente se dé definitivamente
we must
estos territorios
ensure
libres de proyectos extractivos,
that
como la
the
Amazonía,
territory is free
como
from
mencionaba
extractivism, such as the
pues, los
Amazon,
territorios.
as he was
Eso
saying,
se tiene que avanzar
tropical
y que falta,
forest,
y
that
falta
this
porque
must
los
be
pueblos
carried
indígenas
out.
pues están
And as
demasiado
indigenous
buscándolo.
peoples,
Bien,
that's what we are hoping to
de
do.
Colombia, para
And in
mí es
the
muy
case of
importante también
Colombia,
mencionar porque pues
I
aquí
think it is
tenemos
important
también
to also
parte de la
mention
Amazonía
that
y el
we're part
gobierno
of the
colombiano ha
Amazon.
estado muy interesado
And the government has
en
also
lograr
been deeply
rescatar
interested in how to
la
achieve
Amazonía, ¿sí? Cómo proteger
the
ese
protection of
bioma
the Amazon,
pues bajo unas
how
cuestiones
to
mucho más
protect this
gubernamentales.
environment through government-led actions. This is something we are supporting, and through the Ministry of the Environment at COP30, the government shared this, announced this. They are hoping to declare the Amazon as a special environmental biome under the umbrella of the government. I think the intentions are great, and in a way, they are looking to protect this territory. And I think we agree with it, we welcome it, especially in governments that govern over Amazon areas. And if we had this resolution regarding the non-exploitation of the Colombian Amazon for oil, for gas, for minerals, and in general in the Amazon, taking into account the contribution of this territory, understanding that we're fully aware of the role of the Amazon. We were able to work on this framework. And in the case of the Amazon, in the case of the Colombian Amazon, we're talking about territory that is very settled by indigenous people, 64 territories. We have a high percentage of indigenous peoples. And one of the things we've mentioned is that in this territory we have indigenous peoples that are very, very present. And these forests are still alive because of the presence of indigenous peoples. Both local and regional governments have tried to implement this areas, and we have said regarding this, we must take into account that we have a key actor here. We have a key asset here that must be protagonist in the protection of the territory, and that asset would be the voice of indigenous peoples. And the government announced this without the knowledge of indigenous peoples that they were implementing this resolution, that they were declaring the Amazon a special reserve without no extractivism. But how are they going to implement this? In what manner? We must understand the importance of folding in the indigenous peoples in this declaration. We must implement the actions to implement these territories. And as indigenous peoples, we're also governments, especially when we're advancing our work in the implementation of subnational government organizations. So we must have a good coordination between the national government and the territorial government, in this case, indigenous peoples. We're advancing on this. After this announcement, we decided that we had to work with this consultation process, and we are also doing that over the next few months, and we do hope that this resolution will be published as soon as possible, and this will allow us to ensure and to safeguard this territory, because we do realize that the government has some statements that says no more extractivist projects in these areas, but at the same time they offer some loopholes in which, well, on some exceptional circumstances, we may look into how we extract these critical minerals or strategic materials, and that forces us to question: what are we talking? Are we talking about we're going to talk about a full commitment to non-extractivism in this area? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Oscar. It's really important to hear how these laws are actually enacted, and it seems incredible that the government would not have consulted with indigenous governments and leaders before making that kind of statement. As you say, indigenous peoples are the infrastructure through which this kind, excluding fossil fuels, is actually possible, because it's through their actions that the forest is there. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm conscious we're very low on time, but I want to invite people from our audience to ask questions. I invited you to put them in the chat. I can also see in the chat people are connecting and sharing their agendas, which is very much what we hope, that people find a community of like-minded organizations and individuals that they may want to work with. We also welcome you to get in touch with us if you want to be put in touch with somebody that you've seen speak in one of our webinars or seen in the chat. So Laurie is asking, how can Indigenous peoples learn more or participate? Yeah, this is a really good question, and it does obviously depend on your geography, where you are in the world, which networks exist. But maybe I can ask our panelists if anybody wants to comment. Laurie, where are you in the world? Can you say? Maybe you can put that in the chat. Ignacio, are you willing to, or Oscar, would you like to take that question? How can Indigenous peoples learn more or participate in these processes? And Edson Krenak in the other question and answer asked a similar question in terms of how different groups of Indigenous peoples are constituted at different moments. For example, around the Santa Marta conference, if you wanted to have input into that, how would you do that? So Laurie is in the Caribbean. Yeah. Oscar, would you like to take that question about how to find out more?
Yes, of course. Thank you for your question. Well, we have been trying to find ways to make sure that Indigenous peoples participate in decision-making spaces. I think that has been a major challenge. We Indigenous peoples have been excluded from decision-making processes at different levels, at the international, national, regional level, at the local level. So, of course, that forces us to find ways to make sure that each government in our countries allows for the participation of Indigenous peoples. How can we also improve capacity building so that we can participate in national and international agendas? How can we make sure that Indigenous peoples are heard and feel recognized in those, acknowledged in those spaces? That is extremely important. And one of the things we need to achieve is we need safeguards and guarantees in terms of participations. That is one of the main pillars that we want to achieve. And it's not enough to just participate. We also need to make sure that our proposals are heard. And how can we make sure, what guarantees do we have that the interaction will be mutual and bilateral in the decision-making processes? Of course, we need guarantees for this. Sometimes our territories are located in very remote areas in many parts of the world, in many countries. Because of this, we are confronted with an additional limitation as members of Indigenous peoples. Some Indigenous peoples are not aware of all these discussions because of that, because there's a difference between what we discuss here and conveying this information to other people. The internet allows us to do that, but of course, for remote areas, it can be really hard. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oscar. You're speaking to so many concerns that people have about how to participate both at the local level in your territory and also in these international processes. It's a big challenge. But through the UN system, every process should have representatives from all 7 sociocultural regions, and that is one route to do that. I'm aware that we're at the final time, and I want to thank so much our panelists, to Oscar Daza Gutierrez, to Wara Iris Ruiz Condori, and to Ignacio Aranis. Thank you all so much for giving your time. Thank you to you, our audience, for attending and for engaging with this material and for sharing what you have learned from this webinar and what you feel is valuable. Please take it and share it in your communities in the way that Oscar says we create the web together to link each other with the information that we need. And Paula has just shared in the chat also our feedback form. We are very grateful for your feedback. I want to thank also the Tinta team and the Clua team for supporting our webinars. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which is on June the 16th, about fossil fuel phase out, the just transition and transition minerals. So very much following on from topics that we've been discussing today. Thank you so much, everybody.